present with us on our day conference, October 7th, here at the memorial in this actual room. You can see there the flyer has now been completed. We just need to add the QR code, which you can then access on your phone. If you go to our website, unfortunately I don't have internet here, I would have shown you where to go on the website, but if you go to our website and you navigate to the top of the home page where it says activities, there's a drop down menu and you'll see the day conference. Once you click into that, that'll take you to Eventbrite.
Actually, it's not under activities, it's a separate tab on the
Okay,
right.
Go back. Erase. So it's a separate tab, even better. It's a separate tab. If you go into that, it will take you to Eventbrite and then you can register and pay online. If you don't want to do that, we also have hard copies at the back at our registration table and you can do that today. So you can see we have a number of eminent speakers will be present. It's a full day starting at 8:30 to 9 o'clock registration from 9 to 4:30, including refreshments, food and beverage. And also, we're very fortunate to have organised with the memorial a back room. Is that how they look at it? Is it a back room?
Back of the house.
Back of the house, sorry, thank you. Right. A back of house tour, which is only done once a year, but they're offering that to us as well. So you can go into rooms that are never open to the general public. So that's also included. The running sheet will also be included very soon. So I do draw your attention to that. I'll mention it again, and there's also a bio there. It's $50 for non-members, $40 for members. If you sign up, you get the $40. So there you go. So you save $10 if you only join up. That's a bit of a sense. All right. So just give me a moment while I move from one presentation to the next. This morning for our lecture, July lecture, we have Angus Britts. And this morning's lecture is looking at the grand strategy, which is the Singapore strategy. Angus is a well-known Australian historian who graduated with a postgraduate research master's from the University of Sydney, and his major area of historical interest is British Imperial Naval Defence and the Singapore strategy. Angus' books on this theme include Neglected Skies, The Demise of the British Naval Power in the Far East, 1922 to 42, which covers a wide period of history that takes the British Navy from the heights of its might to the point of near decay at a critical time. A Ceaseless Watch, Australia's third-party naval defence, 1919 to 1942, published in 2021, illustrates how Australia confronted the need to base its post-World War I defence planning around the security provided by a major naval power. Angus is also looking for a publisher for his latest book, titled Something Less Than Fools, The Australian Shadow of the Singapore Strategy. We can put our hands together to welcome Angus Britts.
Good morning, everybody, and it's a great pleasure and privilege to be here today to talk to you about a subject which this year celebrates its 100th anniversary, and that is, of course, the Singapore strategy, one of the most contentious and controversial grand strategies in military history and a repository for a considerable portion of the Australian military mythology in the post-war era. So let's get right to it. What was the foundations, or where do we find the foundations of what became the Singapore strategy? For this we have to go back to the second half of the 19th century, a time of great transformation for the maritime world in general, from sail to steam, and also for commercial and military purposes, construction from wood to iron and steel. And in order for the Royal Navy, which had global responsibilities in protecting the British Empire, to sustain its operations, there was a necessity to establish a new network of coaling bases and associated ancillary support services to the Eastern Suez, enabled to sustain the protection of the British Empire through maintaining the mobility of the British fleet. Now, for the majority of this period, 1860 to 1900, the British government was committed to an imperial-centric defence policy. However, in the latter stages of the 1890s, a strong lobby began to develop amongst British political military circles, which favoured a continental style defence policy being instituted. And this gained considerable traction in the early part of the 1900s, mainly through the appointment of Sir John Fisher as the first Sea Lord and the subsequent escalated naval arms race between Britain and Germany, so that by the outbreak of the First World War, Britain was entirely committed to a policy of continental naval defence, which involved bottling the German surface fleet, at least, up in the North Sea, preventing it from menacing the British blockade. And by and large, the course of the First World War proved the correctness of this policy, because with a few isolated examples, such as the pursuit of Admiral Graf von Spey's East Asia Squadron in the early months of the First World War, there was very limited surface activity beyond the North Sea. Same could not, of course, be said for the subsequent German U-boat campaign. So, by 1919, however, the Royal Navy faced a major problem, even though it had just achieved success in the Great War. This stemmed from a number of events, first of which was in the scuttling of the High Seas Fleet in June 1919, the 21st, in order to prevent its expropriation to the Allied powers as war reparations. At a stroke, the continental defence, as the primary Navy defence policy, had been removed, leaving the Royal Navy with no alternative than to fall back on an imperial strategy for peacetime. In August of the same year, a second detriment arose in the presence or the introduction of what was known as the 10-year rule. And this was a requirement for British Armed Services, all three of them, to present their annual budget estimates on the basis that there would be no war between Britain and another major power for a period of at least 10 years. The underlying cause of Britain's adherence to an imperial strategy which targeted Japan as the most likely opponent, despite the fact that at the time that Japan and Britain were both parties to the 1902 Anglo-Japanese alliance, and the Japanese constituted no threat whatsoever in the short term, was, however, the underlying relationship between the Royal Navy and the British shipbuilding industry, and therein the smooth and orderly operation of the British military-industrial complex as far as it applied to the operations of the Royal Navy. Basically, it was a self-sustaining relationship, providing the shipyards could be kept in work, have sufficient orders, the Royal Navy would be able to be regenerated throughout peacetime. If this was allowed to slip, however, it would result in the mothballing of many of the industries and the loss of highly skilled workforces. And these were explicitly required for any new rearmament initiatives, which incidentally at the time were underway, because the British had started a new and potentially highly costly arms race with this time with the United States and Japan. So in order to pursue this policy, a strategy was required, of which the following elements were placed in, parameters I should say, were placed in front of the fleet planners. These were, in order, the provision of a major state-of-the-art naval base at Singapore due to its strategic location on the shipping routes to Southeast Asia and Australia, the Indonesian archipelago. The deployment through peacetime of a small squadron of battle cruisers at Singapore as originally proposed instead of a large Imperial Pacific Fleet, which the Australian government had been demanding, and that the setting of a period called a period before relief, which was a 2 to 3 month period in which it was anticipated that it would take the main British fleet to reach Singapore in the event of hostilities with Japan, and that Singapore Island itself had to be made impregnable against any form of Japanese assault. Now, the assumptions underlying these initiatives were as follows. The planners regarded the likelihood of immediate attack as remote, given their expectation that the expedition would have to be launched to capture Singapore, would have to be launched from Japan, and in the process it would have to have stopovers to capture Hong Kong and the major base and port facilities in French Indochina. As such, there would be no immediate assault planned against Singapore Island. Secondly, any assault against Singapore could not take place from the landward side, that is, across the Straits of Johor following landings in southeastern Malaya. The reason for this was that at the time, the infrastructure, that being road and rail infrastructure in Malaya, was such that it was just believed impossible for a European army, let alone a Japanese army, to undertake this task. And this assumption was really the beginning of a train of thought with disastrous consequences for the British in the long term, namely the misjudgment of Japanese military prowess at all levels except for the Japanese fleet. Now, as it turned out, the proposal was due to be put to the June 1921 Imperial Conference, but before it could be discussed in depth with the delegates from the Dominions, a telegram arrived from the United States Secretary of State, Charles Evans Hughes, informing the gathering that British had been invited to an international naval arms limitations conference hosted by President Harding and due to commence in November 1921. Now, given the economic relationship at the time between Britain and the United States, and particularly the state of British war indebtedness to the United States, this was less an invitation, but rather an offer that could not be refused. Now, as it turned out, the results of Washington had mixed results for the Singapore strategy. Firstly, the termination of the Anglo-Japanese alliance, which had been insisted upon by the United States, which saw it as an impediment to its own strategic ambitions in the Pacific, gave considerable justification for the British to pursue a Japan-centric imperial strategy, given that the conduit for friendly relations between Japan and the West had been removed, and as such, there was considerable scope for distrust to develop between the parties that were now required to join a four-power pact for consultation purposes, but nothing further besides. The second outcome of the Washington Naval Conference was far less friendly, because it revolved under treaty the reduction of the British fleet to what is known as a one-power standard. Now, under legislation passed by the House of Commons in 1889, the Royal Navy was committed to maintain strength equal to the next two navies in strength combined. However, with the negotiation of what became known as the Five-Power Pact between Britain, the United States, Japan, Italy and France, the reduction to a one-power standard at a stroke removed any possibility of the Royal Navy, at least in the short term, exercising its global policy on the basis of a two-ocean navy. And this was reinforced by building holiday for capital ships and size reductions upon new warships. Nevertheless, planning for Singapore was revived and continued, and eventually produced some results. It was approved by the British Cabinet in February 1923 and then confirmed at the Imperial Conference in October 1923. Although, in its approval, two of the dominions were flatly opposed to participation for various geographical and geopolitical reasons, and these being South Africa and Canada. Australia and New Zealand were content that the strategy be implemented, even though Prime Minister Stanley Bruce was not terribly sure how it would work. Almost immediately, the project was cancelled. In March 1924, at the behest of the incoming Labor coalition government headed by Ramsay MacDonald, MacDonald was a staunch advocate for the abolition of Singapore. He considered it a waste of money and considered that it would make it far more likely that Japan would choose a course of a future aggression against the British Empire. It was restored some months later in November 1924, following the succession of a conservative coalition government led by Stanley Baldwin, and construction commenced in 1925. Over the following period, from 1925 to 1932, there were numerous delays, most of them brought about by the worsening economic situation, leading to another suspension in 1929 when the MacDonald-Labor coalition returned to power, and not revived again until 1932 in the wake of Japan's forceful annexation of Manchuria, which involved a high degree of concern on the part of the British political and military establishments. The result was an accelerated construction program, which was eventually realised on the 14th of February 1938. A true state-of-the-art naval base, the most advanced in the world, capable of dry docks capable of servicing the biggest battleships and ocean liners, at a cost of £60 million 1938 value, which was the equivalent of 1 year's entire naval estimates throughout the early half of the 1930s. The fixed coastal defences, big guns for Singapore, were all installed by 1939. This involved separate batteries of 15-inch, 9-inch and 6-inch coastal artillery. And as part of the program, 3 aerodromes had been constructed on Singapore Island. Now, in 1937, there was a significant addition to the Singapore strategy as proposed, and that was the inclusion of Malaya. Because by 1937, the British Army had come to realise that further infrastructure developments on the Malayan Peninsula made it indeed possible that an assault could be mounted from Malaya. However, this was stymied from the outset by inter-service conflict. The RAF, who had basically been blindsided by the Navy and the Army in the installation of coastal artillery back in the 1920s, the decision to do so, was so aggrieved by this original rejection that when it came time for them to site the new airfields in northern Malaya, especially and in central Malaya, they did so in the absence of any prior consultation with the Army regarding the suitability of the sites chosen. So, where did Australia stand in all of this? Well, pretty soon after the introduction of the Singapore strategy, in fact, as soon as Stanley Bruce had got off the boat from London, divisions manifested upon political lines. The Australian Labor Party was committed to a policy of national defence and reliance on the League of Nations for dispute resolution. The Conservatives, the Conservative government naturally having supported the British initiative, favoured imperial defence. And this set the pattern basically for the remainder of the interwar period at the political level. As far as the armed forces went, however, the divisions did not occur until the late 1920s, when the then head of Army Intelligence, Colonel John Laverack, was required to draw up an appraisal of Australia's future defence. And while this appraisal did include the remote possibility that the Japanese could launch some form of amphibious assault against Australia itself. It was mostly concluded by Laverack that any direct Japanese assault against Australia would basically involve raids and not invasion. However, Laverack's findings were rejected by Frederick Shetton, who was the incoming Secretary of the Department of Defence. And so this set the scene for considerable division amongst the Australian Armed Services. The Army basically backing national defence, the Navy, who've got a pair of brand new cruisers, courtesy of the British, backing Imperial Defence, and the RAAF sitting on the fence. They were basically having a bet each way. Now, much of the debate amongst the Australian military was driven by budgetary concern, because by 1930 the Australian Armed Forces had been well and truly emasculated in terms of budget revenues. They were essentially a subsistence level skeletal organisation in all three cases, and incapable in the short term of offering any worthwhile resistance had the country been attacked. And so it was that the debate, with the deteriorating situation both in Europe and in the Far East by the mid-1930s, both the political and military components of this debate coalesced, and in 1937 the tipping point was reached. The 1937 federal election, where defence became a major issue. And in the election, the incumbent Joseph Lyons, UAP coalition, was able to retain power by basically taking what is best described as the big stick of British race patriotism to John Curtin and Labor, charging that by rejecting the imperial policy that Curtin and Labor were disloyal to Australian Britons. And given that this viewpoint enjoyed considerable popular support at the time, it was hardly surprising that Lyons was re-elected. But Lyons, in the wake of the election, also recognised the parlous nature of Australia's armed forces and put in train a wide-ranging program to improve the situation. As for the strategy itself, it underwent a number of distinct phases. That is the operational portion of the naval strategy. From 1925 to 29, it was offensive-based, with the anticipation that the main fleet would actually eventually operate in Japanese home waters, operating from Singapore. Following the Depression, with the onset of the Depression, this instead became a defensive strategy, with the idea that the main fleet would block Japanese access to the South China Sea, and hence to penetrating the Malayan Barrier into either the Indian Ocean or into the Indonesian archipelago, and thereafter threatening northern Australia. In 1938, the concept of the main fleet was removed entirely, to which neither Australia and New Zealand were informed. This was by way of the so-called Backhouse Drax policy, put together by Admirals Backhouse and Drax, which substituted the main fleet for a rapid response flying squadron, comprised notionally of 2 battle cruisers, an aircraft carrier, and a cruiser and destroyer screen. But even this downgrade did not prove to be the end of the matter, because in mid-1939, with war looming very close in Europe, the British at last decided to defer all strategic naval commitments to the Far East. A decision which was greeted with considerable angst by Stanley Bruce, who at that point was the High Commissioner in London, and he made his feelings well known to Lord Chatfield, the Minister for Coordination and Defence, in a meeting they held in July 1939. So, the outbreak of war in September 1939, what was the actual condition of the Royal Navy? Could they fulfil the strategy? Well, as the Dominions had been formed at the 1937 Imperial Conference, the need to remodify the Royal Navy's existing ship strength in short order, along with the construction of 3 new capital ships and 4 aircraft carriers, meant that a considerable portion of the fleet would be staggered out of action over the period 37 to 42 to enable these modifications and constructions to take place. However, because of the effects of the Depression, which had led to the mothballing of many of the shipping and ancillary industries, by the outbreak of war, conversions had only been completed on 4 of the existing 15 British capital ships. And the only modern large warship in the British fleet was the aircraft carrier Armed Royal, which had been built during the 1930s. In fact, the only 2 modern capital ships in the Anglo-French force were the French battle cruisers Dunkirk and Strasbourg. Much of this state of incomplete readiness can be laid at the feet of the Admiralty's own policies, particularly those from the late 1920s. For as the money began to run dry, the Royal Navy, instead of putting in place a due and reasonably considered modernisation program, elected to spend its money on keeping the present fleet in fighting trim for the event of an emergency. And by doing this, aside from limiting the effectiveness of a rebuild regime in the future, they also failed to spend sufficient money on emerging technology, particularly as it related to naval aviation, which left the British with a very poorly equipped fleet air arm, particularly in the lack of modern single-seat monoplane fighter aircraft. Once war was underway, the one single event in the opening 10 months of the conflict that caused more damage to the Singapore strategy than any other was the fall of France. The British Empire, as a result of the fall of France and the loss of the French fleet, was forced to adopt a reactionary grand strategy, basically racing from one point to the other to put out various bushfires that the Germans had started. And at this point in the war, the Germans held overwhelming momentum and land, sea and air. Now the British were successfully able to curb some of that momentum at sea and in the air, but on land there was no stopping the Germans. And when it came to the destruction of the French army, this was achieved in a very short period. As a result, the naval element of the Singapore strategy, given the entry especially of the Italian fleet into the war, which was substantially larger than its German counterpart, the naval element was suspended in June 1940. The RAF was now handed the baton of the first line of defence in the Far East, despite the fact that there were only 48 aircraft in the Far East. But most importantly of all was the forthcoming Japanese military annexation of French-owned Indochina. The north of French-owned Indochina being annexed in July 1940, following German pressure on the Vichy colonial administration, and then the latter half being accomplished by July 1941, which precipitated the American oil embargo. And the critical effect of this was it removed the margin of time that the expedition now could be launched from Hainan or Haiphong or Camaran Bay and be in Singapore in a matter of days, thereby allowing no time for preparations once a declaration of war had been made. However, it was tribute to the Royal Navy's persistence and the excellence of its operational command and tactics that by August 1941 a rethink was underway. And this produced what became known, following discussions between Churchill and the Admiralty, as the Aden, Singapore, Simonstown Triangle Strategy, which basically meant that the British fleet in the Far East would be available to conduct operations within that particular triangular area and in the vicinity of the South China Sea, as required. Now, this was achieved through a number of naval successes, particularly against the Italians at Taranto in November 1940, with the attacks against the anti-Italian battleships, the decisive victory obtained at Cape Matapan of the Italian fleet in March 1941, and the subsequent sinking of the Bismarck in May 1941. These successes were enhanced by the negotiation of what became known as the ABC-1 agreement between Britain and the United States in March 1941, which in the event of war led to a commitment from the United States to transfer a portion of the its Pacific Fleet capital ship force into the Atlantic, thereby freeing up British capital ship deployments in the Far East. It should be pointed out that as far as the Singapore strategy, American participation in the Singapore strategy, they wanted to run 1,000 miles away from it, mainly because they had their very own Singapore strategy when it came to the defence of the Philippines. So, the discussions between Churchill and the Admiralty revealed the following results. An Eastern Fleet would be sent to the Indian Ocean, scheduled March, April 1942, to be preceded by a squadron strength force to Singapore in December 1941. And the specific purpose of this squadron was to deter Chinese aggression in the South China Sea, but also in the minds of at least the British Foreign Office, to possibly deter Japan from undertaking war itself. And given the size of the squadron, proposed squadron, which amounted to one modern battleship, Prince of Wales, the old battle cruiser Repulse, 4 destroyers, and the aircraft carrier Indomitable, which was unable to join the expedition due to damage it sustained before leaving the West Indies. This assumption on the part of the British Foreign Office was highly speculative indeed. So it came on the evening of the 7th of December, Malayan time, that is the 6th of December, Malayan time. Significant Japanese invasion force was approaching their objectives of Singora and Pantani in ports of Singora and Pantani in southern Thailand, and the port of Kota Bharu in far northern Malaya, which was just below the frontier between Malaya and Thailand. The Japanese force, under the direct command of General Yamashita Tomoyuki, that is the land element, comprised of 70,000 troops with armoured support. It was assigned for operations in Thailand, Malaya and Burma. The vast majority of the units selected were picked units comprised of troops with extensive experience in the Chinese sphere of operations. They were backed up by the contingent from the Japanese Army Air Force in the form of over 400 combat aircraft. Their crews likewise experienced in China, backed up by a contingent from the Japanese Naval Air Force of 204 long-range land-based aircraft, including attack aircraft, seaplanes, flying boats, and what the new long-range fighter known as the Torpedo, more commonly known in history as the Zero. Naval forces were modest, but somewhat larger than in the cruiser element than those available to the Royal Navy, the AJN 2nd Fleet with 2 fast battleships and a larger cruiser contingent with a large destroyer scheme to shield the 29 transports. So, what sort of opposition were the Japanese going to face? The answer was not terribly much. Under the overall leadership of Air Chief Marshal Sir Robert Propon, Commander-in-Chief Far East, Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, General Officer Commanding Malaya, and Air Vice Marshal Conway Crawford, Air Officer Commanding Far East, the British could assemble a total of 88,000 troops, including the fortress garrison, with no armoured support. The problem with this force, although it was larger than the Japanese, is that virtually none of its troops had been fully trained for operations in tropical conditions, and the vast majority of its troops and their officers had very little prior combat experience elsewhere. The naval forces, as outlined, were minimal, but perhaps the biggest impediment of all was the Air Force, 160 first-line aircraft, roughly half of which were fighters and bombers, 88 reserves, the fighter element being equipped almost exclusively with the infamous Brewster Buffalo fighter aircraft, which were considered by British High Command, even as late as 7th December, to be vastly superior to any of the 3 types of Japanese fighter that would be put up in response. Their defensive strong points in northern Malaya, the chief one being Jitra on the west coast, which I'll come to shortly, the Crow area in the central part of Australian the road to Patani, and Kota Bharu itself. Hostilities commenced shortly after midnight on the morning of 8th December. And for the first 3 hours, it was the Allies which had the distinct running, courtesy of number 1 Squadron RAAF. And this was a quite remarkable achievement on the part of the RAAF, for with just 8 Hudson bombers flying Kota Bharu, it inflicted very considerable casualties on the invasion force, forced the postponement of landing operations at one point. And it must be remembered that these attacks took place at least 2 hours before the attack on Pearl Harbor. And this was a considerable victory for the Royal Australian Air Force, which regrettably has been largely overlooked in post-war literature due to the resultant circumstances of the fall of Singapore, which we now come to. Because come dawn on the 8th of December, everything started going south for the British in a big hurry. First of all, the Operation Matador, which was a preemptive expedition to seize Singora and Patani before the Japanese could land, was postponed over concerns that it would violate Siamese neutrality, or Thai neutrality, I should say. That morning there were unopposed landings at Singora and Patani. Later that afternoon, due to faulty communications, Kota was prematurely abandoned before it was necessary, leaving the Japanese to inherit vast stocks of petrol and ammunition. In that morning, during the course of that morning, large groups of Japanese bombers with heavy fighter escort were able to essentially neutralise the entirety of almost the entirety of the RAF bomber force in northern Malaya, which was caught on the strips while it was refuelling to undertake attacks against Singapore and Patani, and the vast majority of the aircraft were subsequently damaged or destroyed outright. The following day, there was another substantial air attack against Kuantan, in which pretty much the remainder of the bomber squadrons which hadn't been hit before were this time targeted with similar outcomes. And the following day, Force Z off Kuantan was attacked by elements of the Japanese 11th Air Fleet, and both of the capital ships were sunk. Thereafter, from 11 to 13 December 41, the Japanese land attacks captured Jitra, Crow and Kota, though not in that order. Kota was the first to go, Crow second, and Jitra, the main defensive strong point, was third. Now, Jitra was a village situated on the main road between Malaya and the port of Singora. It was just to the north of the critical airfields of Al-Star and Sunji Patani, which had to be defended, and it was not prepared. Poor defensive outlook. It took 2 Japanese regiments accompanied by 30 tanks to burst through the British defences in scenes reminiscent of Rommel's crossing of the Meuse in May 1940. The entirety of the 11th Indian Division was forced into a rapid retreat, in some cases which became a rout until the situation was stabilised some days later. And the result of this was that there were no substantial land or air forces in reserve to resist the further Japanese advance. And from there until the 31st of January, when they arrived at the shores of the Johor Strait, the Japanese pretty much employed blitzkrieg tactics modified to account for tropical conditions with overwhelming air support, with no armoured encounter, and despite numerous instances of a very gallant resistance, particularly on the part of the 2 Australian brigades and the Malayan brigade, the remnants of the Indian 9th and 11th Infantry Divisions, and for that matter, the remnants of the Empire Air Forces. The Japanese were relatively in trouble in reaching the strait. They commenced their attack against Singapore, which by this stage was in a state of almost total confusion, on the 8th of February, and 7 days later the base fell. I think the quote that now will appear on the screen pretty much summed up the last stage of this epic tragedy. Until the very last moment, General Percival had refused to fortify Singapore's northern shore on the grounds of the weakness of the morale. Simpson said it's going to be much worse for morale once the Japanese start running all over this island, and that is precisely what they did. And eventually, with the capture of Singapore's water supplies, Percival felt compelled to surrender. 130,000, an estimated 130,000 Allied personnel into captivity, and by any measure, it is agreed by post-war historians that Singapore was without a doubt, the fall of Singapore was the worst military disaster in the history of the British Empire. But it was not the end of the story. There was still some of the naval strategy particular to play out. So, with that in mind, let us return to Fort Said on the loss of Same on the 10th of December. Now, aside from the fact that it was the first time in history where capital ships had been sunk by air attack alone at sea, the major point coming out of this incident was that the Japanese had developed, without any opposition, without any comparative development from either Britain or the United States, a means to circumvent the inferior size of their navy, which was only 2/3 of the size of the British fleet and 2/3 the size of the American fleet, according to the provisions of the Washington and London naval treaty regimes. And by developing this incredible long-range, ultra-long-range indeed, air strike arm, the Japanese introduced an element of naval warfare that had never been seen before. Basically, an extra fleet. And over the course of the first 12 to 15 months of the Pacific War, the Allies were to learn to their very considerable cost just how potent the 11th Air Fleet was as an adjunct to the naval carrier forces in particular. And as we can see here, the Repulse and the Prince of Wales were caught out in the open. They had no air support. And from accounts of the ensuing battle, it was more akin to, one could say, to Custer's last stand, in that the poor unfortunate British ships going round and round in circles while they were being circled continuously and attacked by more and more Japanese aircraft arriving, up to 80 of them. And so this was a shocking blow, not terminal, but a shocking blow to British prestige and to the reputation of the Royal Navy. But there was more to come in the form of Operation C. Now, when the Japanese were putting together their master plan to conquer Southeast Asia, the last anticipated operations by the combined fleet were to be 2 raids into the Indian Ocean with the following purposes. The first Air Fleet, under the command of Vice Admiral Nagumo, which had taken part or been the key strike force at Pearl Harbor and Darwin and elsewhere, would send in 5 carriers with a large escort to attack and destroy any assembly of British warships at Colombo, where the Japanese were anticipating reinforcements to be sent. At the same moment, a detached force known as Malay Force, under the command of Vice Admiral Ozawa, would conduct raiding operations in the Bay of Bengal with the objective of paralysing British shipping in the area and thereby securing the left flank of the current Japanese advance in Burma. Now, the British were aware that the Japanese, through ultra-intelligence, that the Japanese were up to something. However, the Admiralty, Churchill, and the commander of the British Eastern Fleet, Admiral Sir James Somerville, believed that the character of the raids would be similar to that adopted by the Germans early in the war, particularly that of the Bismarck and the Swords, run by the Scharnhorst and the Eisenhower. So, the fleet had been intended to operate specifically as what is known as a fleet in beam. In other words, it was a big, large concentration of warships that would act to scare off the Japanese via its size, rather than its capabilities. And it was also, in the event, tasked with defending Australia from invasion if required. Now, at this period, in late March, was a period of extreme criticality for the defence of Australia, because at the same time the Japanese were assembling their forces and operating to the south of Java, and the Eastern Fleet was assembling in Colombo. What were known as the step-sister convoys were underway from the Middle East to Fremantle, carrying the bulk of the 6th and 7th Australian Divisions back from the Middle East to home service. And had the Japanese carriers, or any other element of the Japanese fleet, such as submarines, but particularly the carriers, located these convoys and sunk a considerable portion of them, then the consequences for the future defence of Australia would have been infinitesimal. Absolutely so, given the loss of 2 divisions. So, facing these tasks, Admiral James Somerville possessed 2 forces, Force A and Force B. And as can be seen from the composition of these forces, all of the sins of the Royal Navy in the pre-war era had come back to haunt him. 4 of the battleships were completely unmodified. They were basically target practice for the Japanese. The 2 aircraft carriers carried 90 aircraft between them, and less than 30 of these were single-seat monoplane fighters. The B force in particular was, with the exception of one of the light cruisers and the destroyer screen, totally unable to compete in a modern naval engagement setting. The Japanese had timed their operations to commence in early April, as they did. So followed the sequence of events, the following sequence of events, I should say. On the 30th of March, Somerville vacated his anchorage in Colombo, believing that the Japanese fleet was approaching. Instead, steamed south to set a trap for the Japanese, the composition of the Japanese force being as yet unknown. The Japanese didn't turn up as expected, so Somerville retired to his base at Abu Atoll in the Maldives, which was unknown to the Japanese, fortunately. And thereafter, on the 5th, supplies, while refuelling, he was informed on the 5th of April that Colombo had been bombed at dawn by a very large force of Japanese carrier-borne aircraft. Now, the Japanese inflicted very little damage, mainly because there was very little to hit, but the engagement did develop into a fair old air battle between the Zeros and the largest and most probably toughest contingent of Allied air opposition raised thus far, that being in the form of approximately 60 Hawker Hurricanes. However, the presence of the Hurricanes and airborne early warning radar did not amount to a success on the British part, because the British lost 26 of their fighter planes shot down in exchange for downing 4 of the Japanese dive bombers and a single zero. Offsetting the disappointment, however, of not finding any maritime targets was a subsequent sighting on the same morning by Japanese reconnaissance aircraft of 2 large cruisers heading southwest at great speed. Nagumo, immediately believing this could possibly be battleships, just immediately dispatched a large force of dive bombers, variously counted as between 54 and 80 aircraft, which arrived overhead shortly thereafter, and within 15 minutes had sunk both cruisers. Over the course of the next few days, Somerville attempted twice more to lure the Japanese into some form of trap, an analogue of the action successfully undertaken at Cape Matapan. However, they wouldn't take the bait. And so when Somerville arrived back in Abu on the 8th and was made fully aware of the size of the task force opposing him, he, the Admiralty and Churchill very readily agreed that the Eastern Fleet should vacate the Eastern Indian Ocean as quickly as possible, which he proceeded to order. However, the potential agony for the British was not yet over. For the following morning, the first air fleet reappeared, and elements of its carrier groups carried out attacks against the Royal Navy and Fleet Air Arm facilities at Trincomalee. And following an eerily similar pattern to the first raids on Easter Sunday, that being the 5th, damage was minimal. The British again took the worst of it in the air battles, current air battles. But a subsequent sighting of a group comprising a light carrier Hermes, 2 escorts, including the Australian destroyer HMAS Vampire, and 2 auxiliaries, resulted in a further strike that imported with dive bombers, and this time it took around 30 minutes to sink all of the Allied ships involved. Whereupon Admiral Nagumo quite naturally decided that although he had not located the body of the Eastern Fleet main body, he had certainly given it a bloody nose, and as it turned out, his actions were to result in the Royal Navy not presenting any form of major threat to the western expanse of the new Japanese Empire until at least January 1944, following its complete re-equipping of its carrier air arms. Shortly thereafter, Ozawa too completed his mission, more successfully so, having sunk 29,000 ships, approximate tonnage of 150,000 combined, thoroughly paralysing shipping for at least 3 months in the Bay of Bengal, scaring the you-know-what out of the residents of several Indian towns on the west coast, the east coast of India, I should say, with nuisance attacks, and the subsequent paralysing of British merchant shipping traffic in the area. It indirectly led to a famine in Bangladesh, subsequent famine in Bangladesh, which cost approximately 100,000 lives. Now, with the retirement of Nagumo and Ozawa, the focus of the Japanese naval, the Japanese offensive more generally, switched entirely from the Far East to the Southwest and Central Pacific, where the Japanese were to engage and eventually be thoroughly crushed by overwhelming United States naval power. In the post-war writings, particularly amongst British historians and also amongst Australian historians, there has been a tendency to suppose that if a fleet reached Singapore as originally proposed back in 1923, the situation could have been reversed. And I'd like to say a few words about this. The sinking of the Dorsetshire and the Cornwall drove home the fact that the British fleet in the period December 1941 through the remainder of 1942 was simply incapable of meeting the Japanese on equal terms. In the event of such a combat, perhaps in defence of Australia, a major combat, aside from the superiority the Japanese enjoyed, carrier-borne aircraft and aircrew, the superior speed of the Japanese fleet, and the possible addition of the 11th Air Fleet, the major difference arose in tactics. And this was the Japanese mass carrier spearhead, which had been introduced by Yamamoto as part of the planning for Pearl Harbor in April 1941, opposed to what could be best described as the integrated fleet tactics which the British had used against the Italians and the Germans, remembering that neither the Germans or the Italians possessed an aircraft carrier. And these tactics had been extremely successful because they involved the aircraft carrier slowing down the opposing force to sufficient speed so that the slower British battleships could catch up and engage. And this is precisely what happened at Cape Matapan and in the ensuing sinking of Bismarck. However, these tactics implemented against a carrier-centric force which could field at full strength over 500 aircraft was simply an invitation to suicide. And as I like to say, just in case a service confrontation had taken place, there was the small matter of His Imperial Japanese Majesty's ship Yamato, the biggest battleship ever built, or the biggest class of battleship ever built. Yamato was in service at the time, 71,000 tonnes, quite fast at 27 knots, with 918-inch guns. The Yamato which was literally twice the size of the British battleships in service, could literally stand off out of range and sink the British battleships one by one. So, with the end, of course, with the transfer of the war into the Pacific theatre, almost exclusively with the exception of the submarine campaign waged against Germany, against Japanese merchant shipping in the Far East, the involvement of the Singapore strategy in Australia's defence largely came to an end. And one would think that, given the experience of Singapore, that the Australian government, future Australian governments, would have walked barefoot from Ballon to Broken Hill before ever getting mixed up in such an arrangement again. Well, that just simply did not occur in the post-war period. what I've described in my book as the shadow of the Singapore strategy. Basically, this involved a continued adherence to a number of the underpinning fundamentals of the Singapore strategy. Firstly, through the use of the doctrine of forward defence from 1946 to 1972 in the Concept of Britain and the United States, and then from 2001 to 2000 to the present day, firstly through the activation of the Angus Alliance following the September 11 attacks in the United States in 2001, and more recently through the establishment of AUKUS to counter an increasingly assertive Chinese military presence in the Pacific, which includes China's efforts to ingratiate themselves with the Solomon Islands government. And the whole concept of forward defence, fighting the opponent abroad rather at home, be it to prevent the dominoes from falling in the Cold War, the overthrow of governments via communist ideology and communist insurgencies, keeping the terrorists offshore, and then, as occurs today, keeping the Chinese under control, were all essentially the same as, in principle, as the Singapore strategy. The second element, which is worth mentioning, is the idea of deterrence. Force said was a failed deterrent. The Eastern Fleet was a failed deterrent. And the reasons for this failure were that the British fundamentally underestimated what they were going to encounter in the way of opposition. Now, as we are all by now well aware, Australia has decided to purchase 8 new nuclear attack submarines, which are scheduled for delivery in the next few decades. It is a worthwhile question to ask of such a policy. Will this be simply a case of force said being revisited? Because amongst the public statements that have been made regarding the submarine issue, deterrence has been raised as a possible justification. On this, I would say simply, and make simply the following comment. A nuclear submarine equipped with nuclear weapons is a deterrent in both its being and its deployment. A nuclear submarine equipped with conventional weapons is a nuclear submarine. It offers no deterrent whatsoever. And this is a very real danger if we continue down the path of considering that conventionally armed nuclear submarines would somehow deter the Chinese military. I'd just like to conclude by giving some reference to perhaps the most important point of the Singapore strategy of war, and that is the underlying reality put forward by the renowned Australian political theorist and scholar Frederick Eggleston in 1912. It is a question that exists and has existed in Australia since the 26th of January 1788 to the 1st of July 2023. Can any nation depend for its defence upon a foreign policy conducted by statesmen responsible to another nation? And this is the dilemma that Australian governments and the Australian military and accordingly the Australian community must face up to in the decades to come. And this is part of the reason why the Singapore strategy still continues to be incredibly relevant to the future conduct of Australian defence and foreign policy. Thank you very much.
I've got time for questions, so if you have any questions. Yes.
What was the rationale in limiting the size of vessels after the conference with the Americans?
The limitation was because in the arms race that was occurring at the time, the vessels that were proposed were simply going off the scale from anything built before or during the First World War. The British, the Americans, and to a certain extent the Japanese were proposing the establishment of fleet with massive battleships the size of the Yamato, huge guns, 18-inch, 20-inch guns. And it was believed at the conference that if you limited the size of battleships, then you limited their impact, limited their costs, and you limited the arms races.
That's a bit like emasculating a navy.
Pretty much was.
Yeah.
That's pretty much what it was.
I thought you said you were going to tell us about the Australian perception of the Japanese capability, that they were all weedy and stupid. And
Oh, the British,
side.
yes, but this
Yeah.
also applied to the Australians, yeah. In fact, it was generally applicable for the British, Australians, New Zealanders, and the Americans. None of the Western European military powers raided Japan, with the exception of the Japanese fleet, in any respect, especially in terms of Japanese aviation. And that was an absolute critical error on the part of the Allies, because when the poor unfortunate Allied pilots climbed into the cockpits of their Buffaloes and their Hurricanes and their P-40s and their Wirraways and flew off to combat the Japanese, they had no idea what they were actually really combating.
No.
And this underestimation cost the lives of hundreds of Allied pilots and aircraft.
Biplanes versus zeros.
In some cases, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Given that the English or the British government spent a long part of the 1930s developing radical new technology in the sense of monoplane aircraft, the creation of shadow factories,
Etc.
the development of radar and things like
Yes.
that. Why was Navy so slow in the uptake of those technologies? Because by 1939, the English had a functioning chain home radar system
Indeed.
right around the British Isles. 78 stations or something ridiculous.
Yeah.
Admittedly, pretty low tech and all of that type of stuff. 30 megs. Why was Navy so slow in picking up those
Mainly
same
because
things?
they had a fundamental choice to make in the budgets immediately prior to the Depression. And that was they either keep the current fleet in service, which would require the devotion of virtually the entirety of the naval budget to do that. That's the current fleet. Or diversify and go off and adopt or allocate far more money to new technologies, particularly in naval aviation. It was a budgetary decision on the part of the Admiralty, particularly under the First Sea Lords Milne and Matten, who followed Admiral Beatty in 1927. It was simply a matter of policy, and quite unlike the situation in the United States and Japan, where they were actively encouraging new technologies, the modernisation of their vessels, even though it meant that at certain stages they had more ships out of commission than they would like. Yes.
What changed to make Midway a success? Did the British pass on the lessons of their failure to the Americans? Why were the Americans successful over there?
For the simple reason that the Japanese, and the Japanese alone, got too smart by half. Basically, the big weakness with Japanese naval planning was that it was completely and utterly over-elaborate. And for Midway, it involved something in the vicinity of 5, 6, 7 individual forces, which were expected to individually to coordinate, no matter that there was radio silence in place. And the Americans were able to take advantage of this overconfidence on the part of the Japanese and strike effectively. Secondly, the American carriers, unlike the British carriers, could carry very substantial amounts of aircraft. They could carry up to 100 aircraft each. The British carriers were lucky to get 45 on board. The Americans therefore had a correspondingly higher degree of better monoplane fighters, and most particularly they had dive bombers, and the Royal Navy did not have dive bombers. The Royal Navy's only dive bomber, purpose-built dive bomber, the Blackburn Skua, had been retired from service in November 1941. So the Royal Navy was essentially operating with fighters and biplane torpedo planes, be they even Swordfish or Albacore. But mostly it was Japanese laxity, and particularly the lax attitude of Japanese intelligence, which enabled the Americans to precisely pinpoint where the Japanese were going to be. And given the skill, particularly of Admiral Spruance, were able to ambush them and effectively destroy the Japanese carrier arm. Yes?
The Japanese defeat the Russians at Port Arthur, surely it was shown that the Japanese Navy
Well,
was a big player.
that's certainly came as a huge shock to the West. However, when one examines the state of what could be best described as the Russian 2nd Pacific Squadron, it wasn't fit to fight anybody. It was only fit for the scrapyard, basically 3/4 of it. And if one goes through the voyage of the Russian fleet all the way from the Baltic to Tsushima, on 2 or 3 occasions it was attacked by imaginary Japanese torpedo boats, which led to a number of British trawlers being sunk by mistake, and in other situations the Russian warships actually firing on each other, along with a few mutinies and a number of nervous breakdowns among senior officers. And by the time the Russians reached Tsushima, they were fit only for slaughter. There was no way that the Russians possessed anything approaching the expertise of the Japanese fleet. Yes?
Look, it always intrigued me because the British were actually leading in aviation warfare when they sunk the Italian fleet.
Indeed, yes.
So, and the Japanese studied this furiously,
Indeed.
picking up their lessons and learned from us.
Yes.
So I'm intrigued why the British didn't themselves go, these aircraft carriers are pretty good things, and then why did they send 2 battleships on their own with no aircraft?
Largely again on a fundamental misunderstanding of the strength of Japanese arms. And one of the misunderstandings was that the Admiral Phillips, who commanded Fort Set, believed the Japanese did not have any planes that could fly with torpedoes over range of 300 miles, which was the standard for Europe, whereas the Nell and Betty aircraft attack aircraft flown by the Japanese had ranges of up to 3,000 miles. In fact, they were only exceeded, twin engine aircraft were only exceeded in range by that of the B-29 later in the war. And they knew the Japanese had this, but they assumed incorrectly that the Japanese would behave in the same fashion as they had and the Americans had, because throughout the interwar period, the basis planning for all 3 navies was on the use of what I've described as integrated fleet tactics. Yes?
Yeah, one of the things that's always intrigued me is that certainly during the 1930s, the British defence budgets, it was very much targeted towards the Navy, then to the Air Force, and the Army got virtually nothing.
Absolutely.
Which is why their army was, one of the smallest the smallest in Europe, certainly.
Indeed.
Yeah, and really was just, as people would call it, the Imperial Gendarmerie. But what staggers me is that given how much they poured into the Navy, although they had some very good ships, and although they had some very good technology, how inadequate so much of it was.
Well, again,
Especially their carriers. I mean, their carriers were, you compare them to the Japanese carriers, the Americans and the Japanese, they both built their initial large carriers like Lexington and Saratoga and Carnegie based on capital ships. And yet, the biggest thing the Brits had was the Royal, which is about half the size.
well, the British also did convert capital ships and carriers in the case of the Courageous, the Glorious, the battle cruiser designs, but they were somewhat smaller. Part of the reason, again, stems from budgetary priorities. The Admiralty just could not see its way clear to put in a proper modernisation program in due time. And the expense of keeping even an obsolescent fleet in continual service was enormous. And they sincerely believed that was the only practical method that they could take during the 1930s.
I might just end it there. Can we just put our hands together for Angus?